Chapter 20. The Tracker. The group assembled outside the tavern with Cerebris, who stood next to a large coach that was driven by 4 wrapped horses. The animals were each wearing strange armored harnesses that were attached to the craft. The members of the rescued band all stood by in new raiment. Their clothing had been given to them by the barkeep Marvin at his boss's instructions. The travelers now wore a lightweight but sturdy leather armor that was colored to blend in with the forest. Each person was given a waterproofed, reinforced cloak that conserved body heat and acted as an extra padding of protection on the wearer's back. Special dark brown leather gloves covered their hands, and they had been provided with reinforced moccasin boots made for silent travel through the forest. They all had been cleaned of dirt, and any minor wounds received in prior battles had been treated. All were given matching waist sacks that carried camping supplies, food rations, and water canteens that could be quickly dropped at a moment's notice if the travelers needed to engage in battle. Finally, each were provided a bladed weapon of their choice, made of an unknown metal and sculpted with beautiful leaf-shaped designs drawn upon the blades. Euclidean and Chino were each given 2 short swords of this design and found the blades perfectly balanced and suited to their fighting technique. Each of the blades gleamed with deadly sharpness and slid into special scabbards that were worn upon their back. They also found scabbards built into their boots designed to hold their personal daggers. Janae, Hope, and Guy were all given superb mechanical bows that were custom fitted to the arm span of each of the hunters. The bowstring was made of an amazingly strong steel cable that bent perfectly and made a mysterious humming sound when released. Each of the archers also carried long daggers made of leaf design in boot scabbards. They were also provided individual quivers of special arrows made from the same metal as the bladed weapons. The arrows were extremely accurate and deadly from up to 100 feet away. Erimus was given a long knife that was made of the leaf-shaped design that fit into a leg scabbard, and a well-honed and lightweight spear with a wickedly sharp spearhead. Benny carried pouches that were filled with assorted throwing projectiles. The boy looked down at the various round projectiles within the pouches at his waist. He saw black circles, yellow circles, and silver circles. Marvin had explained that each of the projectiles did different things, and to be careful with them. Benny also carried a lightweight bag that carried extra camping supplies. Standing just outside the tavern, Euclidean stretched his bandaged and reinforced torso in amazement as he watched their mysterious benefactor walk away from the building with the boy Ejaw in tow. Laden with travel gear, the 2 men disappeared over a rise and out of sight into the trees of the forest that surrounded the tavern on all sides. The bounty hunter had arranged to store their current loot at the tavern while they pressed forward with their plans to find Barbarus. He had a hunch the loot would remain secure. Cerebris met up with the group of travelers assembled before him where his coach was positioned. He was dressed in a camouflage cloak with a hood at that moment. He wore a light brown leather armor with reinforced boots, gauntlets, and gloves. One could see he carried a thin short sword in a leg sheath at his left side, and the coiled steel whip adorned his waist belt. The largest of the weapons he carried was an ancient-looking pike weapon with a flared single-headed axe motif at the top. The handles of the pike weapon were etched with strange symbols, and the weapon's blade gleamed with deadly sharpness as the dying light of the sun fell behind the large screen of trees of the forest. Holding the long pike weapon in his right hand, Cerebris said in a commanding voice, "Right! 2 miles from here through the forest is the main path that Barbarus and his men use every day after sundown. We will ride through the forest and await them to follow to their hideout." "What is your plan once we reach the hideout? There must be numerous armed guards," asked Chino. "Barbarus and his men frequent the tavern often. I know him personally, and I know that he does not travel with more than a dozen of his men at any one time so that they may quickly strike out against unlucky travelers through the forest. With careful planning, we 8 will easily overcome he and his 12 riders," Cerebris responded. Next, he walked over to the large wrapped horse-driven coach and said, "Let's move out! Everyone get on!" The large man waved everyone over to the craft. Euclidean, Chino, Erimus, Hope, Janae, Benny, and Guy all climbed aboard the strange coach and found seats and handholds as Cerebris took up position in a strange chair saddle. Grabbing his steel whip from his belt, he looked behind to see that everyone was ready, then whipped the steel cable over the wrapped horses' heads. The weapon made a strange whirring whip crack, and the creatures nickered and began pulling the coach at a great speed down the path away from the tavern. The wind was flying through everyone's hair as Cerebris cried repeatedly, "Yeah! Yeah!" and flicked his metal whip over the raft horses. His own hair blew freely in the wind, and the large tracker whooped with pleasure as the craft picked up speed. As they left the main path, Cerebris steered the craft away and into the forest. He stopped whipping the creatures and allowed them to slow down, which allowed the craft to move along at a quieter pace. Euclidean was amazed that the craft made almost no sound as it moved along the small dirt path Cerebris had taken them upon. He called out to Cerebris, "So what's the plan to take out Barbarus and his men?" Cerebris responded over his shoulder, "With luck, we'll arrive well before he and his men have crossed the path for the night. As they come upon us, we will let them pass and follow them to their hideout. If my plan fails, this baby can keep up with the fastest rider, and we will chase them back to their fort." Euclidean thought the plan sounded reckless and was fraught with many possible unknowns. He quickly began preparing a backup plan should their first venture go amiss, and pulled Chino over to whisper about his plan. Chino nodded with understanding as he listened to his master's instructions. Just then, Cerebris looked back and saw Hope looking at him as he steered the coach along the path. He grinned at her and gave her a wink and blew her a kiss, which caused her to smile and blush. Erimus saw the exchange and scowled at Cerebris, who saw the man's expression and looked away. He looked around to see Euclidean speaking with the man named Chino, and looked back to see Janae looking out into the forest as they passed. He caught her eye and smiled at her in a roguish way. Janaea praised him for a moment, then looked back out to the forest with a roll of her eyes. The boy named Benny watched the exchange and scowled at Cerebris, who saw the boy's expression and winked at him. The man named Guy held his bow to him and was scanning the forest for danger with one of the special arrows held at the ready. Just then, Cerebris cried out, "Everybody remain calm, I've got this!" Euclidean and the group looked sharply ahead at the path and saw two riders on raft horses running to intercept the coach. The two bandits approached the coach from each side. Just as Euclidean began to reach for his weapons, Cerebris cried out a string of sounds and maneuvered a special lever built into the coach. The lashes holding the armored raft horses lifted off each of the creatures. In unison, the creatures flared out to the side of the coach and rammed the edges of their armored harnesses into the oncoming riders. The riders were taken unaware and were ejected from their saddles as the creatures ran back to the coach, which had been coasting on its own momentum. The creatures artfully ran alongside the coach and aligned themselves back to be reharnessed by Cerebris and began pulling the craft along at its prior speed. Cerebris laughed as he watched the down riders fall behind them and said to the group, "We can only do that trick at a slower pace. One of these days I'll get the creatures to do it when we're really flying." With a shake of his head, Euclidean reappraised their tracker, who was whistling as he drove the craft. Perhaps the man knew what he was doing after all. Shortly later, Cerebris brought the coach to a perfect stop behind a screen of brush. Everyone dismounted from the craft and took out their weapons as Cerebris placed feeder bags on each of his raft horses, then led the travelers away to overlook the main path below. Kneeling down, Cerebris said, "Now we wait. I want someone to hide down closer to the main path. You can use this to signal us if you see someone coming." He held out a small cylindrical device that fit into the palm. The tracker said, "Blow through the device if you see someone coming, and we will hear your bird call from up here. If Barbarus and his men should come, we will let them pass, then chase them to the hideout with the coach. Everyone understand?" Everyone nodded, and Chino took the device and quietly made his way down closer to the path. As soon as he walked into the trees, no one could see him, for he immediately blended into his surroundings. Everyone took up a hidden position and waited for the call from Chino. After 15 minutes, a loud bird call was heard, and they saw several men ride by on raft horses. Euclidean looked to Erimus, who shook his head. It was not Barbarus or his men. Another hour passed. The forest was now pitch black. The bird call was heard again. In the filtering moonlight, Barbarus and 12 of his riders wearing the same patterned windana were seen riding their raft horses along the path at a regular pace. Erimus nodded frantically as he recognized the man who had kidnapped his wife and who had killed his father several days ago. Hope had to restrain him from running down the path. The riders passed, and Cerebris and the group quickly reboarded the coach and quietly pulled out after the bandits. As they came upon the path out of their hiding spot, Chino jumped onto the moving craft from his hiding spot. The riders could just be made out ahead of the coach, and they had not noticed the craft following them. Everyone was quiet as they followed the riders. Cerebris cursed as he saw the riders suddenly pick up speed and took out his steel whip to crack it over the heads of his armored raft horses. The coach flew like the wind down the path and soon caught up to the riders. Cerebris called out, "Archers!" and Janae, Hope, and Guy all began to take careful aim at the riders ahead of them. The movements of the coach made the shots tricky, and as they began to release arrows, many of the projectiles flew off mark as the riders galloped on. One of Hope's fired arrows plunged home into a rider's rapt horse, causing the creature to scream and stumble down and drag its rider down with it. The remaining riders and the coach flew past the downed rider as the pursuit continued. One of the bandits cried out as the arrow slammed into his side, and he fell forward and hung limp in his saddle to fall to the road. His body was trampled by the chasing coach, which momentarily bucked as the craft's wheels rolled over the man's fallen form. Barbarous looked back at the coach as one of the flying arrows narrowly missed him. He cried out a signal to his men, and they all peeled off in different directions into the forest. Cerebris steered the craft to follow Barbarous. The coach bounced along as the 4 armored rapt horses pulled after the man as fast as they could. Cerebris called out a string of sounds as before and released the armored creatures, who individually bore down after the prey they were chasing. As the coach began gliding to a stop, the passengers could see the 4 rapt horses running ahead and ramming their armored form into Barbarous. The bandit was thrown from the saddle to land in a heap on the ground. The armored creatures surrounded the man and prevented him from running as Cerebris and the others ran up to surround him with weapons drawn. Barbarous stood up and had drawn a dagger. He held no other weapons as his bow had been strapped to his rapt horse, who walked at a slow pace some way down the path. His lip was bleeding as he held the dagger out in front of him at the oncoming travelers.
"Where is my wife?"
screamed Erimus, bringing his spear up toward the standing bandit leader. Euclidean held him back as Cerebris approached the leader with his deadly pike weapon. Barbarous laughed as the tracker walked toward him and said, "Cerebris, how good to see you again, old friend. Do you have the coin you owe me from our last game of chance?" He still held the dagger in a ready position. Cerebris came within reach of his own weapon, looked at Barbarous, and suddenly struck out with his weapon. The flared weapon hummed in a strange way as it arced out toward the bandit's hand. Cerebris finished the movement of his attack. The dagger had been cut in half, as had several fingers and half the man's hand. The severed pieces of flesh flew to the ground along with the broken pieces of the man's dagger. Barbarous screamed and grabbed at the wounds of his ruined hand as blood poured down his arm and dripped onto the ground in front of him. He fell to his knees and ripped away his windana to staunch the flow of blood. Cerebris spoke, "Barbarous, old friend, rumor has it you stole this man's wife. I'm going to give you to the count of 3 to tell me where she is, and then I'm going to cut pieces away from your body until you talk. 1, 2... Cerebris swung his weapon in another humming arc, and Barbarous screamed as his left ear was sheared away from his head. The piece of meat flew away into the night, and a bloody hole stared back at the group. Hope turned and walked away from the grisly scene. Euclidean watched the macabre scene as he continued to restrain Erimus, who continued to try to rush at the bleeding bandit. Janae and Benny aimed their projectiles at the man, while Guy and Chino watched the perimeter. Just then, Hope saw several of Barbarous's men riding toward the group and cried out a warning. Cerebris glanced at the oncoming riders and grinned. Looking down at the bleeding mess of Barbarous, he said, "If you wish to get out of this alive, you better call your men down off their rapt horses when they get here." Cerebris placed himself directly behind the bandit leader as the other members of the group took up defensive positions near the transport craft. The group of travelers moved into a ready position with their bows and weapons drawn. Cerebris held his weapon at the ready to remove Barbarous's head as the rest of the riders pulled up on their mounts and surrounded the group. In a light and friendly tone, Cerebris addressed the forest brigands who had arrived. "Good day! If you want your boss alive, get off your rapt horses." He kicked Barbarous, who spoke from his kneeling position. "Do as he says!" the bloody leader cried as he covered his wounds with shaking hands. All the men got off their rapt horses, and none had drawn any weapons. Those that carried bows did not draw them. Euclidean sensed something amiss and quickly counted the riders. Only 8 were present, and accounting for the 2 riders they had lost in the chase, that meant that 2 riders were not there. As he came to this realization, he said to Cerebris, "We need to get out of here now. There are 2 riders missing, and they have likely gone for help." Just then, Barbarous leapt up from his position and pushed Cerebris' pike weapon away from him. He ran towards his men and screamed, "Kill them!" The bandit leader jumped onto one of his men's awaiting rapt horses and began galloping away. All became chaos and confusion as the sounds of melee fighting erupted in the forest clearing. Cerebris engaged one of the brigands and cried out a string of sounds, causing one of his armored rapt horses to run over to him. As Cerebris stabbed his weapon at the brigand, he leapt onto the speeding animal as it ran by and away from the fighting in pursuit of Barbarous. The remaining animals began running and slamming into the other wrapped horses, causing the creatures to squeal in fright and run off into the forest. Euclidean, Chino, and Erimus began to engage the 8 forest dwellers who had drawn out various weapons and began attacking when Barbarous gave the command to kill. As Euclidean and Chino each engaged a bandit, arrows from Janae and Guy slammed into one of the other bandits, knocking him from his feet. Erimus screamed and rammed his spear through the belly of a bandit with large eyes. The bandit screamed as the spear tore through him, and he fell to the ground in his death throes, as Erimus ripped out the spear and stabbed it repeatedly into the man's dead body. Hope began crying as she watched her father stab the man, and with trembling hands she tried to latch an arrow to her bow. Her hand shook too much, and she could not recover as the fighting raged on around her. With the leaf-shaped short swords cleanly slicing through the lightly armored bandits, Euclidean and Chino soon killed their immediate opponents and turned to engage 2 more. More arrows from Janae and Guy began flying to take out more of the bandits, and soon only the 2 bandits that Euclidean and Chino fought were left. Just then, a silver-colored missile flung through the air and struck the bandit that was fighting Chino in the temple. The man fell to the ground concussed, and Chino stabbed the man through his neck. He looked over and nodded his thanks to Benny, who was drawing another silver-colored missile out of his pouch. The final bandit backed away from Euclidean and looked around him at his dead companions. He threw down his weapon and fell to his knees. Euclidean brought up his sword to the bandit's throat and said, "What is your name?" The bandit refused to say anything, and Erimus ran over and struck him savagely across the face 3 times until Chino pulled him away. Erimus shook with suppressed rage, and Hope quietly wept, holding her bow in limp hands as she watched her father beat the man. The bandit's lip had split open, and one of his cheeks began to swell. He spat blood out of his mouth and laughed as he said, "I won't tell you nothing." Just then, Cerebris came riding back into the clearing. He was dragging something behind him with his steel whip and came to a stop. A body was covered in cuts and dirt in a blood-covered mess and was missing parts of its face. Both arms and legs had been completely cut away and the stumps tied with rope. Horrendously, the man still lived and could be seen struggling to breathe around the froth of blood that exited from his ruined and smashed mouth. Cerebris walked toward the bandit and said, "Now I'm going to count to 3, and you're going to tell me where the woman is, or I'm going to begin cutting parts off you. 1, the bandit began urinating and screamed, "She's at the hideout!" Cerebris asked the man, "Where is the hideout?" The bandit began whimpering, and Cerebris walked over to the tortured form on the ground. Bringing up the deadly weapon, he nodded to Euclidean, who grabbed the man by the face and forced him to watch. Janae and Hope each turned away as Cerebris brought his weapon down in a murderous arc. With a wet thud, the weapon bit deeply into the man, who pitifully screamed. The bandit began retching and soon gave up the directions. Using rope, they tied the man to Cerebris' coach and boarded it to leave for the hideout. They left the bleeding form and all the dead men where they lay in the forest. Soon after the party left, many large scavenger animals fell upon the bodies to feast.